Nhpum Ga Hill, Burma, the night of April 6, 1944. A man crawled out of the American line and into the dark. No rifle, just grenades tucked against his body. He moved on his elbows through the mud, forward, toward the sound of the Japanese camp maybe 200 yards out. He could smell their cook fires. He could hear them, low voices, men settling in before an attack. He stopped. He listened, and he understood every word. The strange part isn't that he understood them. The strange part is that he was never supposed to be there at all. 2 years before that night in Burma, the United States government put this man behind barbed wire. They called him an enemy alien. They took the years of work, the neighborhood, the ordinary life he had built, and they locked him up. Because of his face. His parents were in Hiroshima. 3 of his brothers were in uniform on the other side of this war. One of them had been fighting for Japan on Guadalcanal, the same island where American boys from your town, from your father's unit, were dying in the mud and the jungle heat. And this man, the one the government called a threat, the one they put in a horse stall in California while they figured out what to do with him, was lying in the dark in Burma, listening to Japan plan its next attack, so that American soldiers could live through the night. His name was Roy Matsumoto, Staff Sergeant, Merrill's Marauders, and before that night was over, he was going to do something that no one in the history of the American military had ever done. He was going to stand up in his foxhole and shout an order, in Japanese, directly at the soldiers coming to kill his friends, not to surrender, to send them running into the guns that were waiting. This is that story, and it is also the story of what this country owes a man it once decided to cage. If something about that already feels important to you, hit the like button right now. Not for this channel. For men like Roy, the ones whose names never made it into the history books, but who decided, in the dark, who got to go home. To understand what Roy Matsumoto did on that hill in Burma, you have to go back to a farm outside Los Angeles, and a name that America couldn't pronounce. Roy's grandfather arrived in California in 1888. He came from Hiroshima Prefecture, and he came the way most Japanese immigrants came in those years, with very little, looking for land he could work and a place he could stay. He found a patch of ground in Laguna Beach, and he farmed it. His son Wakaji followed in 1908. 2 years later, a woman named Tai Kimura arrived by ship from Japan. She had never met Wakaji in person. She had seen a photograph. That was the arrangement. A picture bride, as the community called it. You chose from a photograph, and you trusted that what you saw was what you were getting. T and Wakaji settled into the life the family had been building. And in 1913, their son was born. They named him Hiroshi. His first week of school, his teacher looked at the name on the enrollment card and told him it was too hard to say. She would call him Roy instead. He went home that afternoon as Roy Matsumoto. America had its requirements. For the first 8 years of Roy's life, his world was that Southern California farm, the soil, the neighbors, the rhythm of a small agricultural community where most people worked hard and nobody had much. Then, in 1921, the family made a decision. They were going to visit relatives in Hiroshima, just for the summer. The summer stretched. The depression was coming. It was already in the air. The squeeze on wages, the hostility toward Japanese workers that had been building since the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and never really stopped. The family looked at what was waiting for them back in California, and they looked at what they had in Japan, and they decided to stay. Roy was 8 years old. He didn't choose any of it. He went to Japanese middle school, Chugako. He learned calligraphy, mathematics, the kind of literature that was considered appropriate for a Japanese boy his age. He did the mandatory military drills that were part of the curriculum. He learned how to stand in formation, how to respond to a command, the posture and the cadence that the imperial education system built into every boy, whether they asked for it or not. He was a California kid doing military training in Hiroshima. He got through it the way you get through things you don't particularly want to do, by keeping his head down and waiting it out. As the years passed, the rest of the family settled in Hiroshima for good. His brothers and sisters came. His parents settled in. Roy, 17 years old, got on a boat back to Long Beach, alone. He didn't explain that decision in any interview. He just did it. He crossed the Pacific by himself, enrolled at Long Beach Polytechnic High School, graduated in 1933, and stayed put while the rest of his family remained in Hiroshima. He left Japan when he did, and the timing mattered more than anyone knew at the time. If he had stayed even a year longer, he almost certainly would have been drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. When the war came, Roy Matsumoto got to choose his uniform. Not every man in his family would. After high school, he worked odd jobs at first, the kind of work available to a young Japanese-American man in Southern California during the Depression, which is to say, not much and not well paid. He found his way into delivery work, running groceries for a market that served the Japanese community in the Los Angeles area. It was the kind of job where you see a lot of people, and you don't make much money, but you learn things without realizing you're learning them. The customers at that market came from all over Japan: Hiroshima, Osaka, Okinawa, Kagoshima. Every prefecture had its own way of speaking. Not just different words, but different rhythms, different sounds at the ends of sentences, different ways of clipping certain syllables or drawing others long. Standard Japanese was one thing. What those customers spoke in casual conversation was something else entirely. And it was different from customer to customer and neighborhood to neighborhood. Roy chatted with them. He made small talk while he handed over the groceries. He wasn't studying. He was just being polite, being friendly, doing his job the way you do it when you want people to be glad to see you come to the door. He had no idea what he was doing to his ear. Now, before we go further, this is the part of the story that most people never heard, because Roy Matsumoto's file at the Military Intelligence Service was classified for 50 years. He came home from the war, and he didn't talk about it. Not because he was ashamed, because he was under orders not to. Which means that everything in this story, the crawling in the dark, the listening at enemy lines, the moment that saved an entire battalion, all of it sat in a folder in a government building for half a century, while the man who did it grew old and went fishing and collected eyeglasses for the Lions Club. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. By 1941, Roy Matsumoto was 28 years old. He had his job. He had his neighborhood. He had built exactly the kind of ordinary American life that doesn't make anyone's front page. Steady work, a small apartment, a city he knew well enough to navigate without thinking. And he had a family scattered across 2 countries that were about to go to war with each other. Here is what that family looked like on the morning of December 8th, 1941. The morning after Pearl Harbor. Roy's brother, Tsutomu, who went by Tom, was in the United States. He would, like Roy, eventually serve in the American Military Intelligence Service and retire as a colonel. His brother Noboru was in Japan. Noboru had been conscripted into the Imperial Army. He was in the artillery. He had been stationed at Guadalcanal. His brother Izo was in Japan. Imperial Army. His brother Hiroshi was in Japan. Imperial Army, assigned to China. Their parents, Wakaji and T, were in Hiroshima. Their sisters were with them. The family that had arrived in California in 1888 with nothing and built something. One farm, one household, one life at a time across 3 generations, had been split open by a war none of them started. Parents and sisters in a city that had not yet learned what an atomic bomb was. Roy was in Long Beach. He turned on the radio and listened to the news. The news came over the radio on the evening of December 7th, 1941. By the next morning, the FBI was moving through Japanese neighborhoods in Long Beach. They didn't need warrants. They didn't need evidence. They needed faces. Community leaders went first, the Buddhist priests, the men who ran the Japanese language schools, the businessmen who had spent 20 years building something in Southern California. Gone within days. Their families got no explanation, just an absence where a person used to be. Roy watched this from his apartment. He was 28 years old. He had a job and a life and a city he knew. He had nothing to hide, and no way to prove that. 2 months later, on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It authorized the military to remove people of Japanese descent from designated zones along the West Coast. 120,000 people. 2/3 of them were American citizens, born on American soil, who had never set foot in Japan and had no intention of going. The order did not distinguish between citizens and non-citizens. It did not require proof of disloyalty. It required a face. Roy's face qualified. They sent him first to Santa Anita. Not the Santa Anita you might be thinking of. Not the grandstands and the infield and the carefully maintained track. The racetrack had been converted into an assembly center while the government figured out where to put everyone. More than 18,000 people moved through that facility in the months after Pearl Harbor. Roy's assigned quarters were in the stabling area. He slept in a horse stall. The floor had been swept, but not thoroughly. There were still traces in the wood, hay pressed flat. The smell that doesn't leave a place just because you've stopped using it for its original purpose. He made his bed, and he stayed. From Santa Anita, the Army moved him to Jerome Relocation Center, Chicot County, Arkansas. Swampland converted into barracks, barbed wire strung around the perimeter, guard towers at the corners. The Arkansas Delta in summer is a different kind of heat than California. Humid in a way that settles into your clothes and stays there. Roy found work in the mess kitchen. He organized food stores, managed supply logistics, figured out how to feed hundreds of people 3 times a day out of what the government allocated. He was good at it. He found the inefficiencies and fixed them without being asked. Inside Jerome, people were working through the same set of questions that every Japanese-American family in every camp across the country was wrestling with. The government eventually distributed a loyalty questionnaire, 2 questions that would determine whether you were cooperating or not. Men who answered no to both became known as no-nos. Some lost their citizenship. Some were separated from their families and sent to a different camp entirely. The arguments about those questions ran through every barrack in Jerome. Roy didn't argue. He listened. He watched. He made his observations and kept them to himself. That was already a habit. It would matter later. In 1942, recruiters from the Military Intelligence Service came to Jerome. The Army needed Japanese speakers. Not for stateside work, for the Pacific. They needed men who could read captured documents, translate intercepted radio traffic, sit across from a Japanese prisoner and conduct a real interrogation in the prisoner's own language. They were running out of options. Most Americans who spoke Japanese had just been locked up. So they came to the camps and they asked for volunteers. About 200 Nisei at Jerome put their names forward. Many others refused, and not without reason. A man could be forgiven for looking at the situation clearly. The country had stripped him of his home, put him behind wire, and was now asking him to go fight for it. That argument was available to anyone who wanted to make it. Roy did not make it. He signed his name. He never explained why, not in any way that made it into the record. In an interview decades later, when a researcher asked him about the decision, he gave a short answer and moved on. What he said was that he was American. 3 words, no elaboration. Whatever was behind them. He kept it. They sent him to Camp Savage, Minnesota, the Military Intelligence Service language school, up near Minneapolis, where Nisei linguists were being trained in the specific skills the Army needed, not just conversational Japanese, but the ability to read military documents, interpret technical language, work with dialects that didn't follow standard patterns. Roy finished at the top of his class. His instructors noted something specific about his performance. He had an unusual facility with regional dialects, rural speech patterns, the way people from the Japanese countryside talked when they weren't trying to sound educated. It wasn't something that could be drilled into someone. You either had it, or you didn't. The other students in the program were smart, dedicated, some of them more formally educated in Japanese than Roy had ever been. But when it came to hearing exactly what someone said and understanding exactly what they meant, including the vocabulary of farmers and fishermen and small-town boys who had never been to Tokyo, Roy was in a category by himself. Nobody at Camp Savage knew why. Roy knew. It was the grocery delivery route, the customers, the men who drove out to Los Angeles from their farms and their fishing villages and stood at that counter and talked, in the particular way of people who are comfortable and not performing, in every regional accent Japan produced. He hadn't been studying. He'd been doing his job. After Camp Savage, Camp Shelby, Mississippi, basic infantry training. The Army wanted its linguists to be able to function in combat, not just in a tent behind the lines. And then, a list. 14 names. An assignment to a unit that hadn't been named yet. The orders said the mission would be hazardous. They said it would be of long duration. They did not say where or what the chances were of coming back. Roy was on the list. He packed what they told him to pack and got on the transport. In August of 1943, at a conference in Quebec, the Allied leadership made a decision about northern Burma. The logic was straightforward. Japan had cut the Burma Road, the overland supply route that had been keeping China in the war. Without that road, everything going to China had to fly over the Himalayas, a route so dangerous that American pilots called it the Hump. More than 1,000 men died flying it. The planes that made it through delivered a fraction of what the road had carried. To reopen northern Burma, you needed to take Myitkyina. It was the only all-weather airfield in the region, the one piece of infrastructure that could change the strategic picture in the entire China-Burma-India theater. The Allied generals decided to create an American long-range penetration unit. Something built after the model the British had been experimenting with. Small, fast, lightly supplied, capable of moving through jungle terrain that conventional forces couldn't touch, appearing deep behind Japanese lines before the Japanese knew anyone was coming. They put out a call for volunteers. The description was brief. Hazardous mission. Long duration. No further details. Men from Pacific combat units answered it. Men who had already survived Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Caribbean campaigns. They volunteered for a second assignment without knowing what the first one had cost them the right to refuse. Nearly 3,000 of them. The unit was officially designated the 5,307th Composite Unit. Provisional. Its code name was Galahad, a Time magazine correspondent, trying to find something that would catch in print, named them after their commander, Brigadier General Frank Merrill, Merrill's Marauders. The name stuck. The men used it themselves. 6 combat teams, each identified by color: blue, green, khaki, orange, red, white. 14 Nisei linguists distributed across the teams. Roy Matsumoto went to the Green Combat Team, 2nd Battalion. In October 1943, the unit assembled in Deoghar, India, for jungle training. In February 1944, they started walking. Northern Burma is not the jungle of the movies. It is not open and dramatic. It does not have clearings and dramatic light breaking through the canopy. It has bamboo so dense that a man can stand 2 feet from another man and not see him. It has river crossings where the current moves fast and the bottom is uncertain, and rifles have to be held overhead to keep the actions dry. It has leeches that find their way through any clothing and attach without any sensation at all. It has mosquitoes that carry malaria. And the malaria in that region wasn't the kind you recovered from quickly. It came back. The humidity ran near 95% for most of the day. Daytime temperatures reached into the hundreds. At night, in the highlands, it dropped far enough that men who had sweated through their uniforms woke up cold. Everything rotted. Wounds that should have been minor became serious in days. Boots disintegrated on the trail. Uniforms went first at the seams. Scrub typhus lived in the grass and soil of certain areas. A mite-borne fever that could kill a healthy man in 2 weeks if he didn't get treatment. And treatment was not always available when he needed it. Men who slept on the ground without protection were gambling on which patch of earth was infected and which wasn't. Each marauder carried between 40 and 60 pounds on his back. There were no roads and no vehicles. Mules carried the 60mm mortars and the heavy ammunition. Men carried everything else. And they ate 1 K ration a day. A K ration was designed to be 3 meals compressed into a small package. The calorie count was 2,830, adequate for a soldier doing moderate activity in a temperate climate. It was not adequate for a man moving through jungle terrain, climbing, carrying heavy loads, sweating constantly, fighting off infections. Lieutenant General Stilwell's staff in Lado had decided it was sufficient. They made that decision from an office. The Marauders ate it and kept walking. Roy's job on paper was translator and intelligence specialist. He interrogated prisoners when there were any to interrogate. He translated captured documents, orders, maps, letters from soldiers to their families that sometimes contained information about unit positions and morale. He worked on intercepted radio transmissions. He did all of that. It was real work, and it mattered. But he had also noticed something in those first weeks on the trail. Sound moves differently in dense jungle at night. The vegetation absorbs it in some directions and channels it in others. A conversation happening 200 yards away might be completely inaudible from one angle and perfectly clear from another. The jungle creates its own acoustics, and those acoustics reward a man who knows how to be still. Roy started paying attention to what he could hear at night when the column stopped. Japanese soldiers in the field talked. They talked the way all soldiers talk, about food, about home, about what was going to happen tomorrow and whether they were worried about it. They talked in the voices people use when they are tired, and they think they are among friends, and nobody outside their circle can understand them. The other linguists on the team could follow standard Japanese well enough, but these were not men who had attended Japanese schools in cities. These were conscripts from prefectures that had their own rhythms, their own vocabulary, their own way of cutting certain sounds short and drawing others long. Roy had spent years listening to that, without knowing he was doing it, without any plan to make it useful. He lay still in the dark, and he understood things. The first engagement came in early March, at a place called Wallabum. The Hukong Valley was the main Japanese supply corridor in northern Burma, the artery that kept their northern forces fed and armed and able to resist. The plan was straightforward in the way that plans sound straightforward when you describe them from a distance. Chinese forces under Stilwell would push south through the valley, while the Marauders swung wide around the Japanese flank and set up roadblocks to cut off the retreat. The Marauders did their part. They moved through terrain that Japanese commanders had considered impassable, set up their positions, and held. Roy was on a reconnaissance patrol along a jungle trail when someone in the team stopped and pointed. A telephone wire. Japanese. Running along the ground beside the path, half buried in leaves, heading toward the rear of the enemy position. They didn't cut it. They tapped it. Roy put the receiver to his ear. A Japanese corporal was filing a routine supply report to his commanding officer. Location of an ammunition depot. Current inventory. Security arrangements. The man spoke in Hiroshima dialect, the same rhythms Roy had heard for years at a counter in Los Angeles, from men who drove in on Saturday mornings and wanted to talk while they waited. He wrote down every word. The information went up the chain. American aircraft found the depot and destroyed it. The Japanese supply line through Wallabum collapsed. The Chinese force that had been stalled for weeks began to move. General Merrill awarded Roy the Legion of Merit. He presented it personally. When Roy's commanding officer was later asked by a superior why he hadn't put Matsumoto up for something higher, the Distinguished Service Cross, maybe the Medal of Honor, the officer's answer was recorded in writing. He said, he was only an enlisted man doing his duty. That sentence exists in the historical record. Make of it what you will. They kept moving south. Shadozup, Inkangatong. 2 more roadblock operations in quick succession, each one requiring the same sequence. Days of marching through jungle to get into position. A fight to hold that position. A withdrawal. Then more marching. The distances on a map looked manageable. On the ground, through that terrain, carrying that weight, on that ration. They were not. By late March, after 6 weeks of continuous operations, the unit was fraying at the edges. Malaria was no longer something that happened to other men. It was moving through the ranks methodically, cycling through fevers and chills, and a kind of exhaustion that didn't go away with sleep because there wasn't enough sleep, and the body was fighting too many things at once. The ones who weren't sick were carrying extra loads to cover for the ones who were. General Merrill told the battalion commanders what he'd been authorized to tell them. 1 more mission, and then rest. Replacements. Time to rebuild. The mission was to move south and secure a position at a place called Nhpum Ga. Hold an intersection. Keep the Japanese from using it. Then pull back. The 2nd Battalion, Roy's battalion, drew the assignment. Nhpum Ga was a narrow ridge rising above the surrounding terrain, covered in jungle, with a trail running along its spine. In dry weather, on a map, it looked like a straightforward defensive position. High ground, clear fields of fire on the slopes. On March 28th, 2nd Battalion moved into position. The Japanese moved with them. By the time the Americans had their perimeter set, Japanese forces had encircled the base of the ridge. The encirclement closed the trail in both directions. No supplies in, no casualties out. No way down the slope without entering a killing ground that the Japanese had pre-registered with their weapons. The next morning, no resupply drop made it through. The drop zones were too exposed. The morning after that, the water source ran out. The only water on Nhpum Ga was at the bottom of the hill. Japanese machine guns covered every route to it. Men began rationing what they had in their canteens, then rationing the rationing. In that heat, in that humidity. Doing the physical work of maintaining a perimeter and rotating watch and carrying wounded men and digging improved positions. The body's need for water is not theoretical. Men began going down from dehydration while they still had ammunition. The mules that had carried supplies and weapons into the position were dying. There wasn't room to bury them. The ridge was narrow, the perimeter tight, and the days were hot. By the end of the first week, the soldiers who were not on watch were sharing the ground with animals they couldn't move. The men called it Maggot Hill. The 3rd Battalion was fighting its way south to break the siege. It was moving as fast as it could through the same terrain that had slowed everyone down. Every day they radioed their progress. Every day, 2nd Battalion radioed back. Lieutenant Colonel McGee's radio message, as it was later recorded, was 4 words: "Please hurry." On the 4th day of the siege, Roy Matsumoto went to find McGee. He had a proposal. Every night, Roy had noticed, the Japanese positions were louder than they were during the day. Men off watch talked, fires crackled. The jungle's acoustics carried sound in ways that daylight movement masked. He had been lying in his position at the perimeter and hearing fragments, not enough to do anything with, but enough to know that more was available if he could get closer. He told McGee he wanted to go out past the wire after dark, crawl forward to the edge of the Japanese perimeter, lie still and listen. McGee asked what he'd carry. "Grenades," Roy said, "not a rifle." The sound of a rifle bolt in the dark carries farther than you'd expect. McGee asked what happened if he was spotted. Roy had thought about that. He didn't answer it in a way that was reassuring. McGee said yes. That night, Roy Matsumoto crawled out of the American perimeter and into the dark between the lines. He moved on his belly, stopping every few yards to listen, checking his direction by sound. He found a position in the undergrowth, close enough to the Japanese line to hear voices clearly, close enough that he could make out individual words, individual speakers, the shift from one man's voice to another. He lay there for a long time. Then he crawled back. From that night forward, he went out every night, not because anyone ordered him to, because no one else could do what he was doing, and what he was doing was the only thing on that hill that was working. The men in those Japanese positions were conscripts from rural Japan, talking in the casual voices of men who believe the night is their own. They spoke the dialects of farmers and fishermen, not the clipped standard Japanese of military education, but the particular speech of people from specific places, people who had grown up hearing certain words said certain ways and had never thought about it. He had spent years learning to hear exactly that. The night of April 5th, Roy came back from his crawl with something specific. He told McGee the Japanese were planning an attack before dawn. The direction would be from the east side of the perimeter. They intended to hit the section of the line that had shown the most weakness under the strain of the siege. McGee moved his reserve quietly. No lanterns, no raised voices, men repositioning in darkness, finding their new spots, settling in. At 4:30 in the morning of April 6th, the attacks came from exactly the direction Roy had described. The Americans were waiting. The assault broke. The Japanese pulled back. No Marauders died in that engagement. McGee found Roy when it was light. He asked, "Can you go out again tonight?" Roy said yes. April 6th was a long day. The perimeter held, but the siege didn't lift. Supplies were still not getting through in adequate quantities. The sick were still lying in whatever shade the men had constructed for them. The mules were still where they had fallen. By midday, the Japanese side of the perimeter had gone quiet, not the ordinary quiet of men resting between their activities, something more deliberate. The sounds that had been background noise for days, voices, movement, the occasional metallic clank of equipment, had stopped. The men on watch didn't relax when it got quiet. They tightened. Silence in a jungle means someone has made a decision. At 10 o'clock that night, Roy went out again. He moved more carefully than usual. The silence during the day had told him something was different, and different meant he needed to be closer to hear it clearly. He pushed a little further past the point where he'd stopped the night before. He found what the silence had meant. The Japanese had revised their plan. The previous night's attack had failed because the Americans had been waiting. The force's commander had worked out an answer to that problem. The new plan had 2 waves. The first wave would attack directly into the American line, not to break through, but to draw fire, force the defenders to empty their magazines, expose their positions, commit to that axis, then pull back. Let the Americans reload and reorient. In that moment of reloading, the second wave would hit from the flank. Roy lay in the undergrowth and listened until he had heard it twice, from 2 different voices. Then he crawled back. It was after 2 in the morning when Roy finished his report. McGee gathered his officers in the dark. No lights. Men leaning in to hear. Voices low enough not to carry. The decision was made in minutes. They would not simply defend. They would use the plan against the people who had made it. The forward edge of the perimeter pulled back 20 feet. The ground it had just abandoned was prepared. Grenade trip wires in the undergrowth. Booby traps along the natural approach routes. The jungle's own terrain arranged to do work the Americans wouldn't have to do by hand. The pullback opened a field of fire that hadn't existed before. A clean lane from the new line to the tree line, where the first wave would come through. When the first wave came, McGee's men would let them into the prepared ground. Fire after the traps fired. Break the wave hard. In the confusion that followed, when the second wave was listening for its signal and couldn't find it through the noise, Roy Matsumoto would give them one. Nobody slept between 2 and 4:30. Men checked their weapons in the dark the way you check things you have already checked, because checking is something to do with your hands while you wait. Some of them knew roughly what was planned, some of them only knew to be ready and to hold. Roy sat with his back against a tree and thought about whatever a man thinks about in the hour before. Before first light on April 7th, 1944, the first wave came. They moved through the trees in the dark, and they hit the ground the Americans had just vacated, and the ground answered. Tripwires. Grenades. The line opened fire from its new position, 20 feet back, with the whole prepared zone in front of it. The first wave broke in minutes. The second wave heard it and stopped. In dense jungle, at night, under fire from a direction you didn't expect. The chain of command is only as good as your ability to hear it. The Japanese officer who was supposed to order the second wave forward was somewhere behind the tree line, and his voice was not reaching his men through the noise and the trees and the chaos of what had just happened to the men in front of them. A few seconds passed. The second wave was standing still, in the dark, waiting for an order. Roy Matsumoto stood up in his foxhole. He pulled air into his lungs and he shouted in Japanese, not a translation, not a word-for-word rendering, but the sound of a Japanese officer's voice giving a command, the cadence and the register and the particular authority that those rural conscripts had been responding to since they were called up. The voice of someone above them in a structure they had been trained not to question. Totsugeki. Totsugeki. Charge. Charge. The second wave obeyed. They came through the tree line at a run, in the direction the order had sent them, into the lane that McGee's men had spent the last 2 hours clearing and preparing and waiting behind. The Marauders were already firing before the Japanese reached the halfway point. When the sun came up on April 7th, they counted what the night had left. 54 Japanese soldiers dead. 2 of them officers. Not one Marauder killed in the ambush. The men who had held that hill for 13 days looked at each other in the morning light and didn't say much. There wasn't a lot to say. They were still sick, still exhausted, still on a ridge surrounded by jungle with their dead animals and their wounded men. But the thing that had been coming for them in the dark had come, and it hadn't gotten what it came for. 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, April 9th, the 3rd Battalion broke through from the south. The siege of Nhpum Ga was over. McGee wrote up what Matsumoto had done and sent it up the chain. Whatever came of it in the paperwork, Roy Matsumoto never received a decoration commensurate with what he had done on that hill. He never explained it. He just did it. And for the men on that hill, that was the only explanation that mattered. Merrill had made a promise. After Nhpum Ga, the unit would rest. Replacements would come. Time to recover. Time to rebuild. Time to let the sick men heal. The promise lasted about 2 weeks. Stilwell's staff had identified a window. Myitkyina, the airfield that had been the objective from the beginning, might be vulnerable if you moved fast enough. Before the monsoon closed in. Before the Japanese reinforced it. The Marauders were the only American force close enough and light enough to make the approach. Merrill told the battalion commanders what he'd been told to tell them. They were going again. Some men in the formation that assembled for the next mission could not stand up straight. Scrub typhus does things to the body over weeks that medicine can partially address, but doesn't reverse. Not quickly. Not in the field. They stood up anyway. Some of them were carried part of the way. On April 28th, the Myitkyina Task Force moved out. The Marauders. 2 Chinese infantry regiments. Close to 6,000 men total. They turned toward the Kumon mountain range. The Kumon range rises to over 6,000 feet. The trails through it, such as they were, gained 20% grade in places. Staff Sergeant James McGuire wrote in his diary on the first day of the approach, "Raining. 6:30 a.m. Started hiking. Went up 2,600 feet. Really a tough climb. The path is a 20% incline." He wrote that as a fact, not a complaint. It rained most of the 17 days it took to cross. The column did not stop for weather. It did not stop for the sick. On the morning of May 17th, 1944, the reconnaissance elements of the Marauders reached the edge of the Myitkyina airfield before dawn. By 10 o'clock, the assault was on. The Japanese garrison at the airfield was not prepared for men to have come from that direction, through that terrain, in those conditions. The field fell in hours. An American plane landed on it that same afternoon. Winston Churchill called what the Marauders had accomplished a brilliant feat of arms. Stilwell did not release them. There was still the town of Myitkyina, adjacent to the airfield, held by a substantial Japanese force. The Marauders fought it for another 2.5 months. Malaria, scrub typhus, combat, until August 3rd, when the Japanese commander ended it the way Japanese commanders of that era often ended things when they had no options left. On August 10th, 1944, the 5,307th Composite Unit, provisional, was officially dissolved. 2,997 men had walked into Burma in February. 130 were still fit for duty when the unit closed its books. 93 had been killed in action. 30 had died of disease. 1,970 had been hospitalized. One battalion that had gone in at 564 men reported a final strength of 12. Roy was among those who made it through. He transferred to the 475th Infantry, then to work in China, war crimes tribunals, prisoner interrogations, the cleanup work of a war that was winding down region by region. In late 1945, Roy was working out of Shanghai. Part of his job was going through prisoner rosters, Japanese soldiers who had surrendered or been captured as the war ended, sorted by unit, waiting for processing. He was working through a list from the Japanese 5th Division when he stopped at a name, Yoro Omoto. He read it again. Omoto was his mother's family name. Yoro, Harry, in the family's American usage, his cousin. Roy went to the detention area and found him, a young man in a ragged Japanese uniform who had been fighting on the other side of the same war. His cousin had news. Roy's brother Hiroshi was also a prisoner, held nearby. He had served in the Japanese army in China. Roy found him. Two men, born in California to the same parents, raised in different countries by the accident of a family that had split in half when they were boys. One had spent the war crawling through Burmese jungle in an American uniform, listening to Japanese soldiers plan their attacks. The other had spent it fighting in China in a Japanese one. They stood in Shanghai in the fall of 1945 and looked at each other. There are no records of what was said. There may not have been much. Some reunions don't need words, or the words that come don't come right away, and later you can't remember what they were. His cousin also had word from Hiroshima. The family had survived. They had moved from the house they had been living in, relocated for reasons that had nothing to do with any warning, just the ordinary movement of a family's life, some months before August 6th. The new place was 2 blocks from the hypo center. 2 blocks. There is no way to explain that. Roy didn't try. He stayed in the army. He retired in 1963 as a master sergeant, after 20 years of service. He settled eventually on San Juan Island, in Washington State, far north, quiet. A place where the water was cold, and the summers were short, and a man could go fishing without anyone particularly caring who he was. He helped run the Lions Club. He collected eyeglasses for people on the island who needed them and couldn't afford them. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who showed up when things needed doing and didn't make a production of it. His daughter Karen grew up knowing her father had served. She did not know, for most of her life, what he had actually done. His MIS records were classified for 50 years. The work those men had done, the nights outside the wire, the intelligence that had shifted the outcomes of engagements across the Pacific, had been sealed and filed and kept from the public and from the families of the men who had done it. Karen found out from the records after he was gone. In 1993, 49 years after the night on Nhpum Ga Ridge, Roy Matsumoto was inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame at Fort Benning. In 1997, the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame. In 2011, he received the Congressional Gold Medal, awarded collectively to the Nisei veterans of the Second World War. He was 98 years old when he accepted that medal. The veterans of 2nd Battalion, the men who had been in those foxholes on the morning of April 7th, 1944, said the same thing when anyone asked them about that night. We owe our lives to Matsumoto. Roy Matsumoto died on April 21st, 2014. He was 100 years old, 2 days after Easter, the same holiday that had marked the end of the siege, 70 years before. If your father served in the Second World War, or your grandfather, I want you to think about a dinner table, not a specific one. Any of them. The ones where someone asked a question about the war and got a short answer, or no answer, or a look that meant the question was going somewhere the man at the table wasn't going to follow it. Roy Matsumoto came home from Burma and didn't talk about what he had done, partly because he was ordered not to, partly because there are things that don't translate well from where they happen to a dinner table in peacetime. His daughter found the story in his records. That's how it works with a lot of them. The men who did the things that don't appear in the headlines, who made decisions at 3 a.m. that nobody ever recorded, who came home and went back to being ordinary people in ordinary towns and took what they'd carried with them to the end. In the comments below, leave a name. Where they served. If you remember one thing they said at the dinner table, even a small thing, even something that didn't make sense to you until much later, write it down. Don't let that go. Those stories belong to all of us. Once the people who carry them are gone, they're gone. Roy Matsumoto spent his last years on a quiet island in the Pacific Northwest, collecting eyeglasses for his neighbors, going fishing on the cold water. The men who were in those foxholes knew who he was. Now you do too. November 9th, 1943. A foxhole. 2 men. An island in the Pacific most Americans have never heard of. The younger of the 2 was 21 years old, 3 days past his birthday. He'd been lying in that hole for hours, listening, not to anything in particular, to the dark, to the sound of grenades falling closer with each pass. At some point during the night, he said 3 words to the man beside him. "I'll take it." He wasn't talking about a job. He wasn't answering a question anyone had asked. He had looked at the weapons they were carrying, looked at the situation they were in, done the kind of math that most men spend their whole lives hoping they never have to do. And he had told the man beside him what he had already decided. "I'll take it." Nobody ordered him to say that. Nobody asked. He wasn't the only one. 8 days before that conversation, on the same island, a man from South Carolina had stood up on a beach while a gun was killing the men around him, and walked straight toward it. 6 days after that, in the jungle a few miles inland, a man from West Virginia had thrown a grenade and hadn't moved when it came back. 3 men. 8 days. None of them knew the other 2 existed. This is their story. By the fall of 1943, the United States had been fighting Japan for nearly 2 years. Guadalcanal had been won, at enormous cost. The Japanese had been pushed back, 1 island at a time, across the Solomons chain. The supply lines were shifting. The momentum was shifting. But Rabaul still stood. On the northeastern tip of New Britain, the Japanese had built the most powerful military base in the entire Pacific. 100,000 troops, 5 airfields, a harbor deep enough for a fleet. From Rabaul, Japan could threaten everything south of New Guinea. Every American ship, every convoy, every transport that came within range did so at risk. The American commanders understood the problem clearly. Rabaul could not be taken by force, not without a cost in men and ships that nobody was willing to pay, and not with the resources available in late 1943. A frontal assault was out of the question, but it could be strangled. If American aircraft could fly regular missions over Rabaul, hitting the airfields, mining the harbor, cutting the supply lines, the base would wither on its own. It wouldn't need to be taken. It just needed to be made useless. To do that, the Americans needed an airfield within striking range. They needed flat ground, somewhere in the islands to the south. Somewhere engineers could pour concrete, and carpenters could build a runway, and fighter pilots could take off and be over Rabaul before they ran low on fuel. They found it on Bougainville. Bougainville is the largest island in the Solomon chain, 60 miles wide in places, covered almost entirely in jungle so dense that a man could get lost 20 yards from the trail he'd just left. The Japanese knew it mattered. They had 40,000 troops on the island. The bulk of those forces were concentrated at the northern and southern ends, around Buka in the north, around Buin in the south. The middle of the island, a stretch of swampy coastline along Empress Augusta Bay, was held by a much smaller garrison. That was the opening. Admiral Halsey's plan was straightforward in concept and brutal in the details. Land at Cape Torokina, right in the middle of the island's western coast, where the Japanese were thinnest on the ground. Establish a beachhead. Build an airfield as fast as possible. Then let the aircraft do the work. The resources were thin. There was one carrier group available for air cover, and it couldn't stay indefinitely. Once the Marines were ashore, they would be largely on their own. Each man was issued 1 unit of fire, 1 combat load of ammunition, enough for 1 fight, not more. The men who would make that landing belonged to the 3rd Marine Division. They had been formed just over a year earlier, in September 1942, at Camp Elliott outside San Diego. The division was built from scratch. Cadre officers, freshly trained enlisted men, a handful of veterans mixed in among thousands who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Most of the men in the division had never been in combat. They trained in New Zealand through the Southern Hemisphere winter of 1943, then moved to Guadalcanal to absorb what the veterans there had learned. What the Guadalcanal veterans had learned was not the kind of thing that transferred easily in a classroom. It was the kind of thing you either knew from being there, or you didn't know at all. They tried to pass it on anyway: how to move through jungle without sound, how to read the ground when the ground was trying to kill you, how the Japanese fought at night, and what they did when they thought they had you surrounded, and what they did when they didn't. The 3rd Marine Division listened and took notes and ran exercises in the heat and tried to be ready. Nobody was ever really ready. On the night of October 31st, the convoy moved through Empress Augusta Bay without running lights. The waters were calm. The men aboard the transports were awake long before dawn. Some ate. Most didn't. The men who had been through this before, who had climbed into boats before, who had gone in on beaches before, sat quietly with whatever they had learned to do with the hours before something started. The men who hadn't been through it sat quietly too, because there was nothing useful to say, and they knew it, and because saying something just to fill the quiet felt wrong. On one ship, a sergeant from Spartanburg, South Carolina, sat with his tray in the dark and didn't have much to say. There was nothing left to say. Tomorrow was coming whether he talked about it or not. At 0500 on the morning of November 1st, the ship went to general quarters. At 0637, the destroyers began shelling the shoreline. At 0710, the ramps dropped. The men of the 3rd Marine Division stepped off into the water, and the gun opened up. Nobody on those landing craft could see where it was coming from. What they could see was the result. A boat would be moving toward the beach, and then it wouldn't be. Landing craft went down. Others were torn up badly enough that they couldn't make it back. The men in the water had nowhere to go. Rifle fire couldn't reach the gun. Grenades fell short. The beach at Cape Torokina was narrow, dense jungle pressing right to the waterline on both sides. No angle to flank, no ground to work with. The men who had reached the sand were flat in the black volcanic sand, heads down, the gun somewhere in the tree line, and nobody able to get eyes on it without drawing a burst. Every man who raised his head got shot at. The battalion commander, Major Mason, was moving forward, trying to push his men off the beach when he took a wound. Before they carried him back, he turned toward the men still pinned down in the sand. "Get the hell in and fight." They carried him off the beach a few minutes later. The gun kept firing. Robert Allen Owens was born in Greenville, South Carolina, in 1920. His family moved to Spartanburg when he was still small. He left school after his second year of high school, not because he had somewhere better to be, but because there were bills that needed paying, and he was old enough to help pay them. For 5 years after that, he worked the looms at a mill in one of the towns nearby. Early mornings, long shifts, the kind of work that doesn't make the news. He enlisted in February 1942, a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. He went through boot camp at Parris Island, infantry school at New River, North Carolina. Then the division shipped to New Zealand, then to Guadalcanal for training, not to fight, but to learn from men who had. By November 1943, Owens had been in uniform for nearly 2 years. He had never fired a shot at anyone. There was nothing in his service record that set him apart from the men around him. No combat experience, no special schools. He was a sergeant, 23 years old, and November 1st, 1943 was his first day in a fight. The gun that was killing his men was a 75mm artillery piece, set into a bunker built from coconut logs and packed earth, dug flush into the tree line at the edge of the beach. It had been positioned carefully. On either side of the main gun, smaller positions provided covering fire, each one protecting the other, each one protecting the 75. Any approach from the left flank would walk into crossfire from the right. Any approach from the right would walk into crossfire from the left. The only open angle was directly in front, straight down the barrel. For more than an hour, the Marines on that beach hadn't moved. 40 yards of sand at most before the jungle started. Nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to regroup. Those who had reached the sand were packed into that strip of ground, face down, close enough to the gun to hear it fire, but unable to get close enough to do anything about it. Every attempt to suppress it with rifles fell short. Grenades couldn't reach. Owens had been watching the muzzle flash for most of that hour. He had been thinking about what happened if nobody did anything. The rest of the landing force was still on those boats. The beach had to be cleared. The gun had to stop. And there was only one direction to go. Straight at it, through the open ground in front of the bunker, while the gun was still firing. He called for 4 volunteers. He placed them on the flanks, 2 to each side, with orders to draw fire from the smaller positions, to keep those gunners occupied, to give him 30 seconds of their attention pointed somewhere other than straight ahead. Then he went for the main gun himself. What happened next was put on record by the men who saw it. Owens crossed the open ground in front of the bunker under fire. He didn't sprint. The accounts say nothing about a sprint. He moved toward the emplacement across open sand, under fire, while the gun was still operating. He reached the bunker. He entered through the firing port, the narrow slot cut into the front face of the structure, the same opening the crew used to aim and shoot. From the front, while the gun crew was still inside. Inside, a round already chambered. 150 rounds of high-explosive ammunition stacked beside the crew. He drove the crew out through the rear exit. His men were waiting on the other side. The gun went silent. Owens came out through the rear after them, and then he went down. He died of his wounds on the beach at Cape Torokina. He had been in uniform since February 1942. He had never fired a shot at anyone until that morning. General Alan Turnage, commanding the 3rd Marine Division, would write afterward that among all the acts of courage on that beachhead, no single action saved more lives or contributed more to the success of the landing than what Robert Owens did on the morning of November 1st. The rest of the landing force came ashore. They crossed the beach he had cleared. Most of them never knew his name. He is buried at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines. He was a mill worker from Spartanburg, 23 years old. If you've never heard his name before today, hit subscribe, because there are 2 more men on this island you need to know about. And history forgot all 3 of them. 6 days later, inland from the beach, a few miles into the jungle, the air smelled of wet rot and something burning. A football player from West Virginia was leading his men toward a Japanese machine gun. Herbert Joseph Thomas, Jr. was born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1918. His family moved to South Charleston, West Virginia, when he was 7. He grew up there, went to the local schools, played halfback for South Charleston High, did well enough that after graduation he spent a year at Greenbrier Military School before earning a full athletic scholarship to Virginia Tech. By his senior year, he led every college football player in the state of Virginia in scoring. His mother had died when he was 13. That is the kind of loss that either makes a person or doesn't. For Thomas, it hadn't stopped him. He had kept going, one thing at a time, until the one thing in front of him was a diploma 2 months away. He left before he got it. His friends were joining the Marines, and Herbert Thomas was not the kind of man who stayed behind while the people he cared about went somewhere dangerous. He went into the Army Air Corps first, spent several months there, then put in for a transfer to the Marines because that's where his friends were. And that was reason enough. That transfer put him on Bougainville on the morning of November 7th, 1943. But he had been on the island for 6 days before that morning. He came ashore on November 1st with the rest of the 3rd Marines in the same waves that were being torn apart by the 75mm gun at Cape Torokina. His unit landed east of the Cape. He made it up the beach. He dug in. For the first several days, the work was not combat. It was the grinding, unglamorous labor of turning a strip of sand and jungle into something that could hold. His regiment pushed inland, cutting trails through growth so dense that the men in front were invisible to the men 10 yards behind. They built defensive positions. They ran patrols. They found Japanese stragglers and dealt with them. They learned the ground. On the night of November 6th, word came down through the lines that Japanese troops had landed to the south, at Koromokina Lagoon, 6 miles from the perimeter. A counterattack was coming. Thomas and his men moved out before dawn. The jungle on Bougainville was not like anything they had prepared for. Marines who had come through Guadalcanal said the terrain here was worse. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, the ground below was in near darkness. The trees grew close enough together that a man could lose sight of the man beside him after 10 steps. The ground underfoot was either hard coral rock or ankle-deep mud, sometimes one then the other, within the same 20 yards. Sound traveled strangely. A machine gun firing 50 yards off could seem to come from any direction. Thomas moved through it anyway. He found the first Japanese machine gun position by watching for the muzzle flash through the undergrowth. He moved his men into position around it, 2 to suppress from the left, 2 from the right, and went for it with grenades. It stopped firing. He found the second position dug into the root system of a large tree, the roots providing cover on 3 sides. It took him nearly 20 minutes to find an angle that wasn't covered. He got close enough and used grenades again. That one went silent, too. He kept moving. The third position was in tighter ground. The machine gun sat behind a low rise, with a creek bed dropping away on the left, and a wall of wait-a-while vines on the right, the kind with small curved thorns that caught clothing and skin and wouldn't let go. There was no clean approach from either flank. Thomas looked at it for a moment. His men were behind him, waiting in the cover. He had used the same tactic twice already that morning, and twice it had worked. Throw a grenade into the emplacement, rush it the moment the grenade went off. It was the right call. There was no reason to think the terrain had changed enough to make it wrong. He pulled the grenade. He threw it. It hit a vine in the canopy and came straight back down into the middle of his men. There was no time to warn anyone. There was no time for anything. Thomas dropped onto the grenade. He was 25 years old. His men stood up. They went for the machine gun position, exactly as Thomas had told them to, exactly as he had planned. They took it. The man who made the plan was gone. The plan had not gone with him. Herbert Thomas was the first man from West Virginia to receive the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. In 1945, his sister Audrey put her name to the christening of the destroyer USS Herbert J. Thomas. She broke the bottle herself. In 1946, the city of South Charleston opened a new hospital and named it after him. Virginia Tech named a dormitory in his honor. It stood for decades. He had been a halfback, a scholarship athlete, a man who transferred from one branch of the military to another because his friends were there, and he couldn't think of a good reason to be anywhere else. He made a choice, walked through a door. The door closed behind him. 2 days later, along the Piva Trail, in the dark before dawn, 2 Marines shared a foxhole. Henry Girk was born on November 6, 1922, in Nietzsche, North Dakota. 1 mile north of Nietzsche is the Canadian border. The nearest city of any size is nearly 90 miles away. His parents, Julius and Hulda, had come from Ukraine, passed through Winnipeg, and settled in the far northeast corner of North Dakota, at a time when the land was still cheap and the work was hard. Julius Gurk was a carpenter. He spoke German at home. Henry was the fifth of 8 children. He enlisted in Minneapolis on April 15, 1942, at the age of 19. Boot camp at San Diego, then the New Hebrides, then Guadalcanal, then Bougainville. On the night of November 9, 1943, 3 days after his 21st birthday, he was lying in a 2-man foxhole along the Piva Trail with a Marine named Donald Probst. The Piva Trail ran through the interior of the island, south from the beachhead. Whoever held it controlled the main approach to Cape Torokina from the south. The Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment had been pushing down it for days, trying to break through the Marine roadblock before the Americans could consolidate their position and bring up heavier weapons. The Marines holding that roadblock had been in contact since November 6th. 3 days of fighting in terrain that made movement almost impossible. The jungle on both sides of the trail too dense for units to stay in contact if they spread out more than a few yards. Reinforcement meaning single file down an exposed path. Resupply meaning the same. By the night of November 8th, the Japanese were probing more frequently. The grenades were coming in closer. Earlier that night, the 2 Marines in the foxhole directly beside Gurka and Probst had been killed in the first minutes of one of those probes. Their position was empty. Gurka and Probst were the only ones left holding that section of the line. If they gave way, the entire left flank of the roadblock opened up. They held. Donald Probst was from Seattle, Washington. He carried a BAR, a Browning automatic rifle, belt-fed, capable of sustained automatic fire that a submachine gun couldn't match. In a 2-man foxhole, under grenade attack, in the dark, the BAR was the more valuable weapon by a wide margin. Gurk had the submachine gun. During a lull in the firing, the 2 men talked. It was not a long conversation. They looked at their weapons, and they looked at the situation, and the situation was not complicated. The Japanese were not going to stop. The grenades were going to keep coming closer. At some point, one was going to land in the hole. They agreed. If that happened, the bar needed to keep firing, which meant Probst needed to keep firing. Then Gurk said something that a lieutenant positioned nearby would write down afterward. "If a grenade drops into this hole," he told Probst, "don't worry about it. I'll take it." It was not a dramatic thing to say. There was nothing in his voice, as it was later described, that made it sound like anything other than what it was. A plan. The conversation ended. They went back to watching the dark. The night continued. The Japanese came again before dawn. The grenades came with them, more of them landing closer, probing for the position. One dropped straight into the foxhole. Gurk shoved Probst aside, hard, no time to be gentle about it, and covered the grenade with his body. Probst was wounded in the blast. He got back to his feet. He got back behind the BAR. What happened in the minutes after that is what earned him the Silver Star. Not the act of surviving, but what he did with it. The position he and Gurk had been holding was still the only thing standing between the Japanese and the left flank of the roadblock. The men who had been killed in the foxhole beside them were still dead. Nothing about the tactical situation had changed, except that Gurka was gone. Probst kept firing. The Japanese came again, probing the position, trying to find the gap they expected to be there. Probst was alone now, bleeding, working the BAR through what was left of the night. He kept them back. When other Marines finally reached the position at first light, they found him still there, still holding. He was later evacuated for his wounds. He was later awarded the Silver Star for what he did in the minutes and hours after Henry Gurk died. Henry Gurk is buried at Neech Union Cemetery in Neech, North Dakota. The town of 500 people, 1 mile from the Canadian border, where his father built things out of wood and spoke German at home. His mother, Hulda, put her name to the christening of the destroyer USS Gurk in 1945. He was 21 years old and 3 days when he died. He did not act because he had no time to think. He had thought it through the night before. He had made his decision in the quiet, and when the grenade fell, all he did was keep his word. 3 men, 8 days, 1 island. Robert Owens died on November 1st. Herbert Thomas died on November 7th. Henry Gurk died on November 9th. They never crossed paths. They were operating in different parts of the same beachhead, in different units, on different ground, against different objectives. There was no meeting, no shared moment, no point at which their lives touched. Each man made his decision alone, with only the men immediately around him. The Japanese had a well-constructed plan for Bougainville. General Imamura at Rabaul had estimated the American landing force at somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 men. Several hundred Japanese soldiers came ashore at Koramokina Lagoon on the night of November 6th, the first move of a counterattack designed to cut the beachhead in half before the Americans could entrench. Vandegrift's full landing force numbered over 14,000 men, and they were coming, wave after wave, regardless of what was waiting on that beach. But numbers were not why the Japanese failed at Cape Torokina. Their plan was reasonable. Their execution was serious. They failed because the plan did not account for a mill worker who would enter a loaded artillery piece through the front, or a football player who would use his body to absorb a mistake, or a carpenter's son who had already made up his mind the night before. They kept trying. General Hyakutake, commanding the Japanese 17th Army on Bougainville, spent the winter of 1943 to 1944 preparing. He moved artillery onto the ridges overlooking the American perimeter, piece by piece, dragged through jungle by hand, positioned to cover the airstrips and the supply dumps. He concentrated 12,000 infantry from the 6th Division, plus 3,000 reserves. He was methodical about it. He planned the attack for March, when his forces would be ready, and the Americans, he believed, would be complacent. He planned on accepting Griswold's surrender at the Torokina airstrip on March 17th. On March 9th, 1944, Hyakutake opened his assault. His artillery hit first, the heaviest concentration of Japanese field guns assembled in one place up to that point in the Pacific. The shells fell on the airstrips and the supply dumps and the defensive perimeter. Then 15,000 Japanese infantry went forward on 3 axes, driving toward the center of the American lines. They fought hard. The 37th Infantry Division and the Americal Division, Army units that had replaced the Marines on the perimeter, held, then counterattacked. Hill 700 fell and was retaken. Cannon Hill fell and was retaken. By the end of March, Hyakutake's assault was broken. More than 5,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. It failed, because by then, the airfields were built. The Seabees had started work on the fighter strip while Marines were still in contact on the perimeter. They worked in shifts around the clock, in rain that turned the construction site into a mud flat, under intermittent shelling from the hills to the east. They filled craters as fast as they appeared. They poured concrete for the taxiways with snipers still active in the tree line 200 yards out. On December 10th, 1943, 39 days after the landing, the first Corsairs taxied onto the finished strip and took off. The pilots in those aircraft knew what was below them. They had been briefed on the landing, on the casualties, on what it had cost to hold the perimeter long enough to build the runway they had just rolled down. Some of them had flown air cover during the landings themselves, watching from above as the Higgins boats went down, and the men in the water had nowhere to go. Now they were flying north, over the beach at Cape Torokina, over the tree line where the 75mm gun had sat, over the ground where Robert Owens had crossed open sand with a loaded artillery piece waiting for him at the other end. Rabaul was just over an hour away. A second airstrip opened on Christmas Day. By January 1944, American bombers were running daily missions over Rabaul. The airfields there were bombed and rebombed. The harbor was mined. The supply ships stopped coming. By March 1944, Rabaul was finished as a fighting base. 100,000 Japanese troops remained on the island, sitting, unable to move, unable to resupply, watching American aircraft fly over them for the rest of the war. Admiral Halsey sent a message to the Marines when the first airfield was complete. "You have literally succeeded in setting up and opening for business a shop in the Japs' front yard." 3 destroyers carried the names of 3 men who didn't live to see any of it. USS Robert A. Owens, launched 1946. She served the United States Navy for 36 years. USS Herbert J. Thomas, launched 1945. His sister Audrey broke the bottle at the christening. USS Girk, launched 1945. His mother Hulda broke the bottle. They sailed the same oceans for decades. They never sailed together. Owens, Thomas, Girk, a mill worker, a football player, a carpenter's son, Spartanburg, South Charleston, Nesh. None of them were born to do what they did. None of them woke up that morning with anything in mind beyond getting through the day. Owens saw a gun that was killing the men around him, and understood there was one way to stop it. Thomas threw a grenade and didn't move when it came back. Girk made a decision the night before, told the man beside him what it was, and kept it. There is no formula for that. There is no training program that produces it on schedule, no background that guarantees it, no particular town or family or circumstance that explains it. They were ordinary Americans, the most ordinary kind this country has ever had. Until they weren't. The men who came ashore after Owens, the men who moved through the jungle after Thomas and Girk, most of them never learned those names. That is how it works. You don't stop to find out who cleared the ground you're standing on. You move forward. You do the next thing. You try to make it home. Some of them did. They came back to places like Spartanburg and South Charleston and small towns in North Dakota and Pennsylvania and Ohio. They came back to wives who had been working in factories and raising children and trying not to read too much into the telegrams that sometimes came. They came back to parents who had kept the photographs on the mantel and said prayers at night and tried not to think about what the casualty lists in the newspaper meant. Some of them came back changed in ways that didn't have words yet. The words would come later, years later, decades later. But in 1945 and 1946, there were no words. There was just a man sitting at a dinner table who had been somewhere and seen something and done something, and the family around him who loved him and didn't ask too many questions because something in his face told them not to. Years passed. Some of them sat at those dinner tables for decades without saying much about any of it, not because there was nothing to say, but because some things happened in a particular darkness, on a particular piece of ground, that lose something when you try to put them into words for someone who wasn't there. You can say what happened. You can't always say what it was. Their grandchildren grew up. They saw the photographs. They asked questions sometimes and got answers sometimes, and sometimes got something else. A pause, a change of subject, a hand on a shoulder. These 3 men. This is what was on the other side of that. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, if he came home and sat at that table, and you never quite knew what he'd seen, leave his name in the comments. Where he served. That's all.
Consider a problem. A man has spent 3 years learning a single skill, not casually, not in a classroom once a week. 3 years of daily practice, physical conditioning, and live fire exercises until the skill became reflex, until his hands knew what to do before his mind finished the thought. On the night that skill was tested under real conditions, he performed it flawlessly and accomplished nothing. On the night of October 24th, 1944, the gunners aboard the Japanese battleship Yamashiro fired throughout a running engagement in the darkness of Surigao Strait. They followed their training exactly. They calculated correctly. They fired at the right moments. Not one shell found an American ship. Meanwhile, the American battleships at the far end of that strait, ships that Yamashiro's crews could not see and did not know were tracking her, were hitting her repeatedly. The easy explanation is that the Americans were better gunners. They were not. The harder explanation, the true one, is that by October 1944, the question of who was the better gunner had stopped being relevant. Something had changed in the 2 years before that night. Not the courage of Japanese sailors, not the quality of Japanese steel, not the doctrine that had been built carefully and logically over 2 decades of preparation. What had changed was the nature of the problem itself. And the Imperial Japanese Navy, the finest night-fighting force in the world in 1942, had not changed with it. This is not a story about one battle. It is a story about what happens when a skill is perfected, and the world moves on without it. It begins not at Surigao Strait. It begins 20 years earlier in the decision that made everything that followed feel inevitable. In February of 1922, the major naval powers of the world sat down in Washington and agreed on a number. The ratio was 5 to 5 to 3. For every 5 tons of warship the United States could build, and every 5 tons Britain could build, Japan was permitted 3. It was presented as a peace agreement. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was something closer to a sentence. The men who ran that navy were not naive. They understood the arithmetic. In a straight exchange of firepower, fleet against fleet in daylight at close range, Japan could not win against an American force that was legally permitted to be 60% larger. The numbers did not allow for it, but they also understood something else. Numbers matter most in the conditions that favor numbers. Daylight favors numbers. Open water favors numbers. Long range favors numbers. Darkness favors skill. And so the Imperial Japanese Navy made a decision that was, given the constraints they were working within, entirely rational. They would not try to match America ship for ship. They would make every engagement happen at night. And they would spend the next 2 decades making their sailors the most capable night fighters on any ocean in the world. What followed was not simply a change in tactics. It was the construction of an entire military identity. It began with the eyes. Japanese naval doctrine required sailors assigned to night watch to spend 30 minutes in complete darkness before assuming their posts, allowing the eyes to reach maximum sensitivity before the watch began. Not 10 minutes, 30. The difference between the two, in terms of what the human eye can detect at distance, is measurable and significant. The diet of surface warfare crews was adjusted. Liver, carrots, dark leafy vegetables, each one chosen for a reason. Vitamin A deficiency degrades night vision, and the Japanese Navy was not going to lose a battle because a gunner's eyes were working at 80%. Training exercises were conducted specifically in low-light conditions. Sailors were drilled in silhouette recognition, identifying the outline of a destroyer against a dark horizon, estimating its distance, tracking its movement. Not with instruments, with their eyes. The men who performed these tasks well were promoted. The men who performed them exceptionally were assigned to the ships that would lead the night attacks. Over 20 years, this produced a culture in which night-fighting ability was not an additional qualification. It was the qualification. The weapons were built to match the doctrine. The Type 93 torpedo, what American sailors would eventually call the Long Lance, though they would not know it existed until it had already killed several hundred of them, was the centerpiece of Japan's night attack capability. It ran on pure oxygen rather than compressed air. That single engineering choice produced a weapon that left no visible wake, traveled at speeds exceeding 40 knots, and could reach targets at ranges that no one in the United States Navy believed possible. When the first Long Lance attack succeeded, American after-action reports initially attributed the damage to mines or submarine torpedoes, because the idea of a surface-launched torpedo striking at that distance did not fit what American planners thought was technically achievable. Japan had built a weapon specifically for the dark. And then there was the fire control system. The Type 94 director was a mechanical computer. Optical rangefinders feeding distance data into a calculating mechanism that adjusted for the target's speed and bearing, the firing ship's own movement, wind, and the ballistic characteristics of the shell. A skilled crew operating the Type 94 could generate a firing solution in conditions where American crews, dependent on visual observation, were still trying to locate the target. By the summer of 1942, the doctrine was not theoretical. It had been tested. On the night of August 8th and 9th, 1942, a Japanese cruiser force entered the waters off Savo Island, north of Guadalcanal, and engaged an Allied force of cruisers and destroyers that had been positioned to protect the American landing operation. The engagement lasted 32 minutes. 4 Allied cruisers were sunk. 1 was severely damaged. The Japanese force lost no ships. 32 minutes. To understand what that result meant inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, you have to understand what it confirmed. It confirmed that the doctrine worked. Not in theory, not in exercises, in combat against a real enemy under real conditions. The sailors who had spent years in darkened rooms, memorizing silhouettes, adjusting their diets for the sake of their night vision, they had just sunk 4 cruisers in half an hour without losing a ship. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from being proven right. It is different from ordinary confidence. It has weight behind it. It has evidence. And evidence, real evidence, paid for in the wreckage of 4 Allied cruisers on the floor of Iron Bottom Sound, is very difficult to argue against. No one in the Imperial Japanese Navy, in the autumn of 1942, had a reason to doubt that night was theirs. They had just proved it. What none of them knew, what would take 2 more years and a great deal of wreckage to begin to understand, was that the proof was already out of date. 3 months after Savo Island, the same waters, the same darkness, the same narrow channels between the same islands, the same strategic objective, control of the sea lanes around Guadalcanal, where American and Japanese forces had been fighting for months over a single airfield in the jungle. On the night of November 14th and 15th, 1942, Japan sent 2 battleships south. Their names were Kirishima and Otago. Their mission was to bombard Henderson Field, the American airstrip on Guadalcanal that Japanese commanders needed destroyed. They had done this before. 2 weeks earlier, a similar force had shelled the airfield successfully. There was no particular reason to expect this night to be different. What the Japanese commanders did not know was that the Americans had changed the guard. Waiting in the darkness to the south were 2 American battleships, USS South Dakota, USS Washington. South Dakota was one of America's newest battleships. Washington, though of an earlier class, had been sent specifically to stop exactly this kind of Japanese night operation. Both ships carried radar. What would matter on this particular night was which ship's radar kept working. South Dakota, shortly after the engagement began, suffered a series of electrical failures. The exact sequence of events has been debated by naval historians for decades. What is not disputed is the result. South Dakota's radar went dark, her fire control systems were compromised, and she became, for a critical period, a large steel shape moving through the night without the ability to see or to aim. She was also, because of her position and her size, highly visible. The Japanese crews found her. Kirishima and the accompanying cruisers concentrated fire on South Dakota, scoring hits across her superstructure. By the standards of Japanese night-fighting doctrine, it was a textbook performance. They had located a target in darkness, closed the range, and delivered sustained, accurate fire. The doctrine was working. What none of them knew was that Washington had not stopped working. Captain Glenn Davis held his ship back, kept his radar active, and watched the entire engagement unfold on his screens. He could see Kirishima. He could track her. He knew her speed, her heading, her distance, not approximately, but precisely updated continuously as she moved. Washington's radar at this stage of the war was the Mark III fire control system, an earlier generation than what American battleships would carry 2 years later, but sufficient for what Davis needed on this particular night. He waited until the geometry was right. Then he closed to 8,400 yards and opened fire. What happened in the next 7 minutes was not a gun duel. It was not two ships exchanging fire and testing each other's strength. Washington put at least 7 16-inch shells into Kirishima in those 7 minutes. The Japanese battleship, which had been operating with complete confidence inside a doctrine that had served her navy so well, had no meaningful opportunity to respond. Her fire control was oriented toward South Dakota. By the time her crews understood that a second threat existed, Washington had already done the essential damage. Kirishima was left dead in the water. She sank before dawn. If you had been standing on the bridge of an American ship that night and someone asked you to explain what had just happened, the explanation would have seemed almost too simple. Washington could see Kirishima. Kirishima could not see Washington. Washington shot at what she could see. Kirishima shot at what she could see. One of those two targets was real. The other was a damaged ship that happened to be in the wrong place. The Japanese after-action reports reached a conclusion that was accurate as far as it went. The operation had failed because South Dakota's electrical problems had drawn Japanese fire and allowed Washington to attack from an unguarded direction. The loss of Kirishima was attributed to an unfortunate combination of circumstances: an enemy ship that had gone undetected, an engagement that had unfolded differently than planned. It was not wrong, but it was incomplete in a way that would prove fatal. The reports described what had happened. They did not ask why Washington had been able to close to 8,400 yards in complete darkness without being detected. They did not ask how Washington had generated firing solutions accurate enough to put 7 shells into a moving target she had never seen with human eyes. They did not ask what system had made that possible, whether Japan possessed an equivalent, or what it would mean for future operations if she did not. Those questions were not asked. In the years that followed, the United States Navy did not stop developing the systems that had allowed Washington to fight that night. They improved them. The SG Surface Search Radar, deployed more widely from 1943 onward, could detect a battleship-sized target at up to 20,000 yards in complete darkness. The Mark VIII Fire Control Radar, a significant advancement over the Mark III, could lock onto a target and continuously update a firing solution as both ships maneuvered. The two systems together did something that no amount of human training could replicate. They removed the darkness as a variable. It was no longer a question of which crew had better night vision. It was no longer a question of which gunners had spent more hours in darkened rooms memorizing silhouettes. The darkness, which Japan had spent 20 years learning to own, had been made transparent. Japan knew radar existed. Japanese engineers understood the physics. Japanese scientists had developed their own radar systems. The Type 22, fitted to ships including Yamashiro, could detect large surface targets at useful ranges. But the Type 22 had a fundamental limitation that its American counterparts did not. Its angular resolution, its ability to determine not just how far away a target was, but precisely where in the arc ahead it was located, was poor. At combat ranges, the margin of error in bearing measurement could translate to hundreds of yards of positional uncertainty. You could know something was out there. You could not know exactly where, with the precision required to aim a gun. The Type 94 director had been designed around optical range-finding, human eyes feeding precise observations into a calculating mechanism. It was an excellent system for the conditions it was designed for. When a target could be seen, even dimly, it worked. When the target could not be seen at all, the Type 94 was dependent on whatever the Type 22 could tell it, which was not enough. Between November 1942 and October 1944, Japan fought and lost a succession of night engagements in which this gap, the gap between what Japanese radar could tell a fire control system and what American radar could tell one, played a decisive role. The losses were recorded. The pattern was visible to anyone looking for it. What the Imperial Japanese Navy did not do in those 2 years was look for it, not because the officers were incompetent, not because the information was not there, but because the information, if followed to its conclusion, would have required dismantling something that Savo Island had proven with evidence, with wreckage, with 32 minutes of textbook execution. And organizations do not easily dismantle what they have proven. 2 years passed. The gap widened, and on the night of October 24, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent a battleship into a strait where 6 American battleships were waiting, each one equipped with the systems that Kirishima had encountered in the dark, each one improved and refined through 2 more years of war. The gunners on Yamashiro were ready. They had trained for this night their entire careers. They did not know what was waiting for them at the other end of the strait. But we do. Stand behind the gun. That is where this part of the story belongs. Not on a map, not in an admiral's chart room, not in the operational summaries that historians would write decades later. Behind the gun, on the main battery deck of Yamashiro, in the darkness of Surigao Strait, on the night of October 24, 1944. The man standing there had been trained by the finest naval gunnery program in the world. He knew his weapon. He knew his station. He had drilled this exact scenario, night engagement, enemy surface force, restricted waters, more times than he could count. Everything he had been taught told him that this was the kind of fight his navy was built to win. Yamashiro entered the strait as part of a larger force, Vice Admiral Nishimura's Southern Force, tasked with breaking through to the Leyte Gulf landing beaches as one prong of a complex multi-directional operation. The plan required coordination across vast distances. It required timing. It required that the pieces arrive when and where they were supposed to. Nishimura knew the risks. He had received reports of American surface forces in the area. He continued anyway because the mission required it, and because the doctrine gave him reason to believe that darkness would provide what it had always provided: cover, concealment, the equalizer. The Type 22 radar aboard Yamashiro was functioning. It was returning contacts ahead, shapes in the darkness, bearing and range, updating as the ship moved forward through the strait. The contacts were real. The Americans were there, exactly where the radar said they were. The problem was not the information the radar was providing. The problem was the information it was not providing and could not provide. Range, the Type 22 could give. Approximate bearing, it could give. But the angular precision required to hand a firing solution to the Type 94 director, the precision that would tell the director not just that a target existed at a certain distance, but exactly where in the arc ahead it sat, updated continuously as both ships moved. That precision was beyond what the system was capable of delivering. The Type 94 had been designed for eyes. It was being asked to work with something considerably less than eyes. On the American side of the strait, the situation was different in every meaningful respect. Rear Admiral Oldendorf had arranged his force with deliberate care. 6 battleships in a line across the northern end of the strait. Cruisers extending the line on both flanks. Destroyers deployed in the approaches to make torpedo attacks on anything that came through. The battleships were the last element, the end of a layered defense that Yamashiro would have to survive before she reached open water. Each of those battleships carried SG surface search radar and Mark 8 fire control radar. Each of them had been tracking Yamashiro for the better part of an hour. They knew her speed, they knew her heading, they knew the rate at which she was closing. The fire control computers had been running solutions continuously, updating with each new radar sweep, refining the calculation as the geometry changed. When the order to open fire came, the American guns were not pointed at where Yamashiro was. They were pointed at where she was going to be. The shells Yamashiro fired that night traveled approximately 40 seconds from gun to impact. 40 seconds is not a long time. It is long enough for a ship moving at 15 knots to travel 350 feet. The American ships knew this. Their fire control systems accounted for it automatically, calculating not the current position of the target, but the predicted position, the place where the target would be when the shell arrived, adjusting for the target's speed and heading and any changes in either. Yamashiro's fire control system could not do this with the inputs it was receiving. The Type 22 could tell the Type 94 where the Americans had been. It could not tell it where they would be. And so Yamashiro's shells arrived at coordinates that were accurate to a moment that had already passed. There is a specific quality to this kind of failure that is different from being outgunned or outmaneuvered. The guns worked. The shells traveled true. The mathematics of ballistics performed exactly as physics required. The failure was upstream of all of that, in the information that fed the calculation, in the gap between what Yamashiro could know about her targets and what the targets could know about her. The American shells were not luckier. They were aimed with information that Yamashiro did not have and could not get. The hits began arriving on Yamashiro from multiple directions simultaneously. Not because the Americans had surrounded her, they had not, but because the geometry of the engagement, a column of ships moving into a line of ships arranged perpendicular to their path, meant that Yamashiro was exposed to the guns of every ship in Oldendorf's line at once, while she herself could only bring her forward turrets to bear on whatever lay directly ahead. She returned fire throughout. Her crews did not abandon their stations. They loaded and fired and tracked and calculated by every method available to them, in the darkness, under fire, doing exactly what they had trained to do. The shells went out. The darkness received them, and nothing came back to indicate they had found anything. At 4:19 in the morning on October 25, 1944, Yamashiro rolled to one side and went under. She took most of her crew with her. The few men who survived were pulled from the water by American vessels in the hours that followed, disoriented, many of them wounded, trying to make sense of a night that had not unfolded the way any of their training had prepared them to expect. Some of them, in the days and weeks that followed, would be asked what it had been like. What they described consistently was not the fear of incoming fire. What they described was confusion. The Americans had known where they were. The Americans had always known where they were. And Yamashiro, with her trained crews, her calibrated guns, her director systems, and her rangefinders and everything that 2 decades of doctrine had produced, had been firing into a darkness that received everything she sent into it and returned nothing. The confusion the survivors described was not a character flaw. It was not panic or failure of nerve or any deficiency in the men themselves. It was the rational response of people whose mental model of the situation bore no relationship to the situation they were actually in. They had been trained to fight a battle in which both sides were equally blind. They were fighting a battle in which only one side was. To understand why that gap existed, and why 2 years and a succession of lost engagements had not closed it, you have to look past the technology itself. The radar was not the cause. It was the symptom of something deeper. Japan's industrial capacity in the early 1940s was not equal to America's, and everyone in the Imperial Japanese Navy knew it. What is less often examined is what that limitation produced. Not just in terms of what Japan could build, but in terms of what Japan chose to believe. Precision radar components, the magnetron tubes, the waveguides, the display systems capable of the angular resolution that fire control required, demanded manufacturing tolerances and material quality that Japan's wartime industrial base could not consistently achieve at scale. This was a real constraint. It was not invented, not exaggerated, but real constraints have a tendency, inside organizations under pressure, to become something else. They become arguments. The argument, in this case, ran roughly as follows. Our sailors have spent 20 years developing skills that no other navy can match. Those skills do not require complex electronics. They require discipline, training, and the kind of institutional knowledge that cannot be built in a factory. We have that. The Americans are building machines to substitute for what we have built in men. It was a coherent argument. It was also, by 1943, a way of not examining the question that actually needed to be asked. The question was this. In an engagement where one side has continuous, precise, automatically updated information about the other side's position, and the other side does not, does the quality of the disadvantaged side's gunnery training matter? The answer, worked out in the waters around Guadalcanal and in a dozen smaller engagements between 1942 and 1944, was consistently the same. It matters at the margins. It does not change the outcome. A gunner who has been trained for 3 years is better than a gunner who has been trained for 3 months, when both are working from equivalent information. When the information is not equivalent, the trained gunner is more efficient at doing something that does not accomplish the objective. He loads faster. He fires more accurately relative to his aim point. He maintains his discipline under fire. And he misses because his aim point is wrong, because the information feeding his fire control system is wrong, because the system was designed for eyes, and the eyes cannot see what needs to be seen. Skill had not become irrelevant. It had become insufficient. There is a difference, and it matters. The Imperial Japanese Navy could have known this. The evidence was in its own records. The pattern of losses in night engagements from late 1942 onward was not random. It followed a shape that, examined honestly, pointed toward a specific cause. But examining the evidence honestly would have required the organization to ask a question it was structurally unprepared to ask. The organization had spent 20 years building a hierarchy in which confidence was the visible marker of competence. Men who expressed certainty were promoted. Men who raised uncomfortable questions about foundational assumptions, questions that implied the last 2 decades of effort might have been directed at the wrong problem, did not advance in the same way. The information existed. The institutional pathway for that information to reach the level where it could change doctrine did not. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been successful. It had built a doctrine on that success. It had built a culture on that doctrine, and the culture, in the end, was better at protecting the doctrine than the doctrine was at winning the war. There is one final detail worth noting. In the same month that Yamashiro went down in Surigao Strait, American shipyards launched more new tonnage than Japan had lost in the entire preceding year. The industrial argument, the argument that Japanese skill could substitute for American production, had been losing ground since 1942. By October 1944, it had lost entirely. But that is a separate story. The story here is narrower and in some ways more instructive. It is not about a country that was outproduced. It is about a navy that trained its gunners to perfection, sent them into a battle where perfection was not the variable that mattered and never fully understood until it was over, why the shells kept missing. The shells that Yamashiro fired that night landed in the water. Some of them may have landed close. In the dark, under fire, the American crews could not always tell. What the after-action reports confirmed was the result. No American ship in Oldendorf's battle line was struck by Yamashiro's main battery gunfire. The gunners had done everything right. The shells had gone where they were aimed. The problem? The only problem, the problem that made every other element of their training beside the point, was that the aim was built on information that the darkness had already made obsolete. Yamashiro sank at 4:19 in the morning. The strait went quiet. In the hours that followed, American destroyers moved through the area, pulling survivors from the water. Of Yamashiro's crew of more than 1,600 men, fewer than 10% survived. The Imperial Japanese Navy fought on for another 10 months. There were operations, engagements, individual acts of seamanship and courage that the historical record preserves in detail. But there was no further large-scale night surface engagement in which Japan's doctrine of night fighting, the doctrine built at Washington in 1922, refined through 2 decades of exercises, proven at Savo Island, and carried into Surigao Strait aboard Yamashiro, was tested against an American surface force. There was no need for one. The gunners of the Imperial Japanese Navy were, by any reasonable measure, among the best-trained naval gunners of the Second World War. That is not a consolation. It is the point. They were as good as the doctrine required them to be. The doctrine had simply stopped describing the war they were fighting, and no amount of skill, however genuine, however hard-earned, however faithfully applied in the darkness of a strait in the Philippines, could compensate for that. The shells went out, the darkness took them, and the water gave nothing back.
In the Library of Congress, in Washington, there is a diary written on the back of a can of mackerel. The man who wrote it did it in the dark, in a Japanese prison camp, with ink he made from burnt charcoal. He wrote on that scrap of tin can label because he had nothing else. And he did it knowing that in this camp, keeping a diary was not against the rules. It was a killing offense. The guards searched for paper the way they searched for weapons. Men were beaten for less. The Japanese did everything they could to make sure not one word these men wrote would ever leave that camp alive. They were thorough about it. They failed. Today his handwriting sits in the Capitol of the United States, preserved, digitized, open to any American who wants to read it, and the order that forbade it is read by no one at all. That's the paradox I want to put in front of you tonight. A dying prisoner's words outlived the empire that banned them. The question is how? How did that diary get out? Off an island that was falling, past a man with one leg, past the bottom of the South China Sea, and all the way home? That's the whole story. And I promise you, the ending is not the one you're bracing for. Stay with me. If you believe stories like this one are worth keeping instead of losing, do me a small favor and leave a like on this video. It's the thing that helps one more person find this man's name. And keeping his name is more or less the whole point of what you're about to hear. Let me take you back to before any of it happened. His name was George Washington Piercy. He was born in 1915 in St. Louis, Missouri. His father, Claude, was an attorney, a well-known one, and George grew up in a house where words mattered, where a thing written down was a thing that lasted. He went to Washington University in St. Louis, and he earned a law degree there. That was no small thing in those years. A law degree in the 1930s, coming out of the teeth of the Depression, was a ticket, a guarantee of the kind of settled, respectable life that most young men his age could only dream about. He could have hung out a shingle, taken the bar, and spent the next 40 years in a quiet office in St. Louis, arguing over contracts and property lines, going home to supper every night. He could have grown old and comfortable and safe. That was the road laid out in front of him, paved and waiting. He took a different one. In 1940, he took his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He trained stateside first, the ordinary posts, the ordinary drills, the last ordinary months he would ever have. And in January of 1941, he shipped out across the Pacific to the Philippines, to a fortress island in Manila Bay, to a garrison a long, long way from Missouri, and to a war that had not quite started yet, but was already on its way to find every one of them. He was 25 years old. He had a law degree in a drawer back home and a whole life he'd set down to go do this. Nobody made him. That's worth remembering, too. Before he left, he wrote home. He wrote his mother a lot, the way a lot of young men did in those years. And in one of those early letters he said something small that turns out to matter more than anything else in this whole story. He asked her to save his letters. "Put them in the lower drawer of my desk," he told her. "I want to keep them as a record of my time in the Army, before the shooting ever started, before a single hardship." This was already a man who wanted his own record kept, who thought the ordinary days of his life were worth holding on to. That instinct, to save, to keep, to not let a thing vanish, is the seed of everything that comes next. Remember it. Because in those same hours that Japanese planes came down out of the sky over Pearl Harbor, other Japanese planes came down over the Philippines. It was already the 8th of December there, on the far side of the date line. But it was the same blow, falling on the same morning. And for George Piercy, and for the men around him, the record he wanted to keep was about to become something he'd have to bleed for. The Philippines did not fall quickly. That's the first thing people forget. You hear the Philippines and 1942 in the same breath, and you assume it went the way Pearl Harbor went. One terrible morning, and then it's done. It didn't. The men out there held on for 5 months. 5 months, while the rest of the world wrote them off. The men on Bataan and on the island fortress of Corregidor fought with what they had, and then with less than what they had. The relief they'd been promised, the convoys, the reinforcements, the ships full of food and ammunition, never came. It couldn't come. Not with the fleet crippled at Pearl Harbor and the whole weight of American strength months and an ocean away. The men out there knew it, too. On Bataan, they made a bitter little rhyme of it. The battling bastards of Bataan. No mama. No papa, no Uncle Sam. They went from full rations to half. from half to a quarter. They held a line they had no business holding, sick and starving, and every man out there was old enough to do the arithmetic and see how it had to end. Bataan surrendered in April of 1942, and the men who marched off it walked into one of the darkest chapters of the whole war. Corregidor, the rock in the bay, held on a few weeks longer, into May, and then it was over. The flag came down, and George Piercy was a prisoner of the Japanese Empire. He would stay a prisoner for 29 months. Say that number slowly. 29 months. Nearly 2.5 years. Not a raid. Not a bad week. Not a battle you survive and go home from. 2.5 years of it, with no end date, no calendar counting down, no way to know if it was ever going to stop. Cabanatuan, north of Manila. Bilibid, the old stone prison in the city, and the penal colony all the way down at Davao, on the southern island of Mindanao. He was moved from one to the next, like a piece of freight, loaded up, shipped out, unloaded somewhere new, and the whole time his body was coming apart on him piece by piece. Malaria. He had it more than once. It kept coming back the way malaria does, laying him out with fever and then the shakes. Chronic dysentery, the kind that hollows a man out from the inside. Beriberi, the swelling in the legs and the feet, the numbness, the deep bone weakness that comes when a body is starved long enough of the plain nutrition that keeps it standing up. He spent long stretches of those months in the camp hospital, which, in a Japanese prison camp, was not a place you went to get better. It was mostly a place you went to be out of the way while you died. Or didn't. Men went in with malaria and came out in a blanket, carried by 4 others who could barely stand themselves. He didn't. Now, I could spend the next 10 minutes on how bad it was. I'm not going to. And I want to tell you why. Because the point of George Piercy is not what was done to him. The point of George Piercy is what he did back. Here is how he lived in there. He had no toothpaste, so he made his own, out of charcoal and salt, and he cleaned his teeth with it. His shoes wore through until there were no soles left, and he walked on what was left of them. He had no razor and no mirror, so he shaved with a knife. When he needed to wash, he waited for the rain. And this is a man who, by his own writing, made a point of not cursing. In a prison camp, where hard, filthy, furious language is about the only free thing a man has left, George Piercy held his tongue, because that was the standard he'd set for himself and he wasn't going to let the place lower it. He read his Bible. He kept his faith, quietly, in a corner of the world that gave a man every reason to lose it. And he was fair, even about the men holding him. This is the part that tells you the most about him. When he wrote about the guards, he didn't paint them all as monsters. He noted that a few of them were, in his own plain words, regular sadists, men who seemed to take pleasure in making the prisoners as miserable as they possibly could. But then he did something most men in his position could never have done. He allowed that the same kind of men, the cruel kind, could probably be found in the American Army too, that they weren't cruel because they were Japanese. They were cruel because some men just are, in every uniform, under every flag. A starving prisoner, with every excuse in the world to hate an entire people, and he wouldn't let himself do it. He wouldn't let the camp turn him into something smaller and meaner than he'd walked in as. That is a free man. Freer, in the ways that count, than the men holding the rifles. He held the line on all the small, private things that a place like that is engineered to strip out of a man. The Japanese Empire had taken his freedom, his health, his rank. It had taken his country's flag off the pole and run up its own. It could not take the man. And here is the thing he did that should make the hair on your arm stand up. In the middle of all of it, Sick, starving, not knowing if he'd see another Christmas, George Piercy sat down and made a list of what he was going to do when he got home. Buy a record player. He wrote, "Start a record collection. Talk to Pop about buying a farm. A man in a Japanese prison camp, wasting away, sitting down to write out his plans for a life he had every reason to believe he would never live. That is not a broken man. That is a man who has decided, in the one place he still governs, his own head, that he is going home, that the war ends, that there is a record player waiting and a farm to talk over with his father. That is faith. The plain, stubborn, American kind." And he wrote it down where the guards could have found it and made him pay. Which brings us to the writing itself, because keeping a diary in that camp was forbidden. Flat out. It was one of the fastest ways a man could get himself singled out, and being singled out in there could cost you everything. George Piercy kept one anyway. He wrote on whatever he could get his hands on. The labels off tin cans, mackerel, mostly, peeled off carefully and saved and turned over to the blank side. Blank Philippine immigration forms he'd scrounged from somewhere. Hospital paperwork. Old maps. The backs of the very letters his mother had sent him from St. Louis, her words on one side, his on the other. Mother and son sharing the same scrap of paper across an ocean and a war. And he didn't just jot down complaints. That's what gets me about it. He filled those scraps with the names of the men around him, who they were, where they were from. He wrote down the food, when there was food, and what it was, and what it wasn't. He kept lists of the expressions the men used, the slang that grew up inside the wire, lists of people he'd met, his plans, his fever charts. He even made notes on another man's diary, a Captain Star, adding his own remarks to it, one prisoner helping keep another prisoner's record straight. It is the ordinary, patient, human record of an extraordinary place. And you have to ask the question, why? Why would a man that hungry, that sick, spend what little he had left, and risk what little he had left, on scraps of paper he might never be able to carry out? I've thought about this one a long time, and I think the answer is simple. And I think it's this. A man that hungry doesn't spend energy on anything that doesn't matter. He wrote because being forgotten frightened him more than the guards did. He wanted somebody to know these men were real, that they were here, that they laughed sometimes and starved always, and held on longer than anyone had a right to ask. He was building a record, patiently, at real risk, the only monument a man in his position could build. He could not have known who would ever read it. He could not have known it would be you, tonight, all these years later. He had no way of knowing it would end up preserved in the capital of the country he served. He just knew, down in his bones, that it had to survive him. Even if he didn't. And in the fall of 1944, the Empire was going to hand him the bill for that conviction. It was going to ask him, in the plainest and cruelest terms, whether he had really meant it. He had. By October of 1944, the war had turned. General MacArthur had said he would return to the Philippines, and now he was coming. And the Japanese knew it, which meant the prisoners they were holding were suddenly a problem to be moved, shipped back toward the home islands, to be worked in the mines and the yards of Japan itself. They moved them on cargo freighters, old ones, rusted ones, ships never built to carry human beings, with cargo holds meant for coal and ore and crates, and prisoners packed down into them by the hundreds and the thousands. Standing room only, no light, no air, no sanitation, for days and weeks at a time. History remembers those ships by a plainer name, the Hell Ships. And here is what made them so deadly. The Japanese did not mark them. There was no Red Cross painted on the hull, no flag, no signal to any American submarine or aircraft that the men crammed into that hold were prisoners of war. To the periscope of an American sub, a hellship looked like exactly what it was on the outside, an enemy freighter. Fair game. A target. The men inside were being killed twice over, once by the empire that held them, and once, by accident, by the country that was trying to win them back. Piercy had written one before, on an earlier transfer, and something happened on that first crossing that tells you everything about the men he was among. This was back in 1942, on the long haul down to the penal colony at Davao, a crossing of many days on a ship called the Erie Maru. Hundreds of prisoners moved south to be worked on the land down there. Piercy kept his diary through it, the way he kept it through everything. On the back of one of his mother's letters, he even drew a picture of the ship. And on that voyage, he worried, in writing, about the one thing he could not afford to lose, his little bag with his diaries in it, and whether some light-fingered man in the crowd might make off with the papers he'd spent so much of himself on. Even then, half-starved on a prison ship, the record was the thing he guarded. It was Halloween of that year. The hold was packed and airless, and an officer in there with them, a man worn clear past the end of what a body can take, died. There was nothing anyone could do, no doctor who could reach him, no medicine to give him, no room in that crush to even lay him out properly on the deck. And the men in that stinking hold, starving, filthy, sick, half-dead themselves, packed in so tight they could barely move, did the only thing they had left in all the world to give him. They came to attention, as best a man can come to attention when he can't stand up, and they saluted him. In the dark, in the heat and the stench of that hold, where not one guard could see them, and not one word of it would ever be written into any official report, where it earned them absolutely nothing, no better ration, no easier day, no mark in any record. They did it because he was one of theirs, and because he had died, and because some things a man does not because anyone is watching, but because of who he has decided to be. That is the caliber of man we are talking about. That is who was down in those holds with George Piercy. Not broken men, not beaten men. Men who, at the absolute bottom of what the world can do to a human being, still stood up in the dark to honor one of their own. Hold on to that picture, because in a few minutes it's going to tell you everything about why this story ends the way it does. Now it is October of 1944, and George Piercy's name is on the list for the next ship, the Arison Maru. On the 20th of October, they marched them down to the water and put them aboard. 1,775 prisoners forced down into her holds. That's a small town, more people than a lot of you graduated high school with. Several times over, folded down into the black iron belly of one ship. Packed in so tight, a man could not lie down, could barely sit. The hatches dragged shut and battened over them, sealing out the light and the air both. Down in that hold, the heat climbed past 120 degrees and stayed there. Men fought for the few inches under the hatch grating where a thread of air came through. Men lost their minds in the dark. It was, by every account that survived it, a descent into something close to the bottom of human suffering. And George Piercy's health was already gone. 2.5 years had spent him down to almost nothing. He knew, going up that gangplank, exactly what his odds were. He was a lawyer's son who kept careful lists and did his arithmetic, and he had made this crossing before. He had no illusions left about what a hell ship was. He knew. So before he boarded, before they shut him down in that hold, George Piercy did the bravest, quietest thing in this entire story. He gave away the diary, Everything he had bled to write for 2 years, every label, every scrap, every name. He handed it to a man who was staying behind, his friend, Lieutenant Robert Auger. Auger had lost a leg at Corregidor, back in '42, lost it in the fighting there. Now he was in the prison hospital, too broken to be shipped to Japan, which meant, God willing, he would still be there when this was over. Auger took the papers, and he gave Piercy his word. If I live, he promised, I will get these home to your family. The family that told this story down the years says Piercy actually split his papers in two, gave half to one man and half to another, both of them staying behind, so that if one didn't make it, the other might, doubling the odds, making sure the record lived even if the men didn't. And there is the whole measure of the man. He spent 2 years risking his life to write it. And then, at the moment it mattered most, he let it go. He put it in the hands of a man who couldn't walk, and he climbed down into that hold, so that his words would have a better chance of living than he did. On the 24th of October, 1944, in the South China Sea, an American submarine came upon an unmarked Japanese freighter and did what it was there to do. The submarine had no way of knowing. There was no flag, no marking, no signal to say that the men in that hold were American prisoners of war, his own countrymen. The torpedoes struck. The Arisan Maru went down. Out of 1,775 men, only a handful lived. George Washington. Piercy was not one of them. He was 29 years old. His body was never found. But the diary was already ashore, already in the hands of a one-legged man who had given his word. Robert Auger kept it, and here is what that actually cost him. He was a prisoner himself, a wounded man, in a place engineered from the ground up to take everything a human being has, and then take a little more. Every day in there was its own fight, just to keep breathing. And on top of his own survival, on top of keeping his own body alive on nothing, he took on the weight of another man's words. He hid them from the searches. He carried them through the moves from one camp to the next. Through all the long, grinding months when it would have been the easiest thing in the world, and the most forgivable, to let a few scraps of paper slip away and be gone. He never did. He held on to them the way a man holds on to the one thing he has decided he will not lose. You have to want to understand that. A starving man does not carry dead weight. Everything in that camp was a cost, every ounce, every risk, everything you had to keep track of instead of keeping yourself alive. Robert Auger chose to carry George Piercy's diary through all of it, because he had given his word, and because he understood, the way Piercy understood, that some things are worth more than the trouble they cost you. He survived. He survived the camp, survived the last brutal year of it, survived to see American soldiers come back through the wire and set them free. And when that day finally came, when Robert Auger was a free man again for the first time in 3 years, the first thing on his mind was not a hot meal or a soft bed or the trip home. It was the promise. In March of 1945, Robert Auger packed up George Piercy's diary and mailed it home to the family in St. Louis. And the timing of it is the whole thing. March of 1945. The Army had not yet officially told the Piercys their son was dead. The formal notice, the telegram from the War Department, the one every family in America dreaded finding on the mat, did not reach that house until late June. 3 months later. Which means Auger got there first, a wounded soldier, freshly out of a prison camp, one leg gone, keeping a private promise he'd made to a friend in a prison hospital. That man beat the entire machinery of the United States Army to the Piercys' front door. The government, with all its telegrams and its records and its channels, was slower to reach that family than one crippled man who had simply given his word and meant it. But there is a harder thing buried inside that letter, and you should hear it. When Auger wrote the letter that went with those papers, he did not know his friend was dead. He wrote to Piercy's parents warmly. He told them George had asked him to get his things home. He warned them, gently, that the diary would show their son had been through a rough stretch. And he wrote hoping, actually hoping, in ink, on the page, that by the time they read his letter, they would already have word that George was safe, that he'd made it to Japan, that he'd turn up when the camps were opened. He'd been dead 5 months. Auger didn't know. The parents didn't know. The letter is full of a hope that had already run out, and none of the 3 people it touched had any idea. Auger kept something else, too, a small black notebook of his own. In it, he'd written the names of the men he'd served with, their home addresses, and what had become of them. A private ledger of the lost, so that somebody would know. Next to George Piercy's name, in pencil, he had made a small, plain note, J, about 9/44. Just that. Taken toward Japan, around September of 1944. Read it cold, and it's nothing. 4 characters and a date. But understand what it is, and it stops you. It is one prisoner keeping track of another. A man in hell writing down, in the smallest hand, the last known heading of a friend, so that if the friend never came back, there would at least be this: a pencil mark, a direction, proof that somebody had noticed he was gone and cared enough to write it down. Keeping the count, making sure that even this, even the bare fact of a man's disappearing, would not go unrecorded, that nobody would simply be erased while Robert Auger had a pencil and a scrap of paper and breath in his body. I'm not going to stand here and call Robert Auger a hero. He'd probably have hated that. I'll just tell you what he did, and let you decide what to call it. A man with one leg, just out of a Japanese prison camp, half-starved, finally free, and the first thing he reached for was a promise he'd made to a man who was already at the bottom of the South China Sea. George Piercy made the record. Robert Auger made sure it got home. Between the 2 of them, the Japanese Empire's best efforts to erase these men came to nothing. There is one more thing that arrived in St. Louis, and you need to hear it, because it's the cruelest and the truest beat in the whole story. In October of 1945, 2 months after the war was over, a full year after George Piercy died, a postcard reached his family. It was one of those pre-printed cards the Japanese let the prisoners send now and then, the ones where you mostly just checked a box to say your health was excellent, or good, or fair, or poor. This one had made its way out of a Philippine prison camp and then vanished into the machinery of a losing empire. Held up somewhere for a year and more, until an empire fell, and the mail it had been sitting on finally shook loose and crossed an ocean and found the right house in St. Louis. It reached them in October of 1945. It said, "Love to both of you. Birthday greetings to Pop." And it was signed, in his own hand, George W. Piercy. A birthday greeting to his father, from a son who had been a year at the bottom of the South China Sea, arriving, in its way, right on time. A voice from a man who was already gone, reaching across the water one last time to say the thing he'd have wanted to say. Love to both of you. You could not write that ending. Nobody would believe you if you tried. His mother, Frances, had gone on writing to him too, long after there was anyone left to read it. In one of her last cards, to him she'd written, "Everyone says you have plenty of grit. Keep your chin up. Much love. Mother." She wrote that to a son who had been dead for months. She just didn't know yet. Now. I promised you at the start that the ending wasn't the one you were bracing for. Here it is. Because you could stop the story there, on the dead man's postcard, on the mother's grief, and call it a tragedy. A lot of people would. I won't. Because it isn't. Go back to the beginning. To the whole reason the Japanese banned those diaries in the first place. They wanted these men erased. That was the whole intent behind it. Not just to defeat them on a battlefield. Armies get defeated and live to write their memoirs. This was something colder. This was making sure that when it was all over, there would be no record left at all. No voice, no proof of who these men were, or what was done to them, or how they held on when there was no earthly reason left to hold on. The ban on diaries was not about discipline. It was about the future. It was about controlling what the world would be allowed to remember. The order that could have cost George Piercy his life existed for exactly one purpose: to make certain that a man like him would leave nothing behind, that he would vanish clean into the bottom of the South China Sea, with not one word to mark that he had ever drawn breath. They failed. They failed completely. Today, the diary George Piercy wrote on mackerel can labels and immigration forms and the backs of his mother's letters sits in the Library of Congress of the United States of America. Not in a box in an attic. Not lost. In the National Library of the country he gave his life for, catalogued and cared for, and treated as what it is: a treasure. Robert Auger's notebook is there beside it. The two friends together again, their words resting side by side in Washington, the way the men themselves never got to. Both diaries have been preserved by the nation these men served, catalogued, digitized, put online, where the whole world can reach them. Which means that any American, anywhere, on any quiet night like this one, can sit down at a screen and call up the actual handwriting of a man who has been gone for 80 years, the very marks he made in the dark on a scrap of tin can label, and read exactly what he wanted them to read. He got his wish, the one he made in that camp, against all odds, with charcoal on garbage. Somebody knows. We know. You know his name now, and you'll carry it out of here with you. And the order that forbade all of it, the command that could have gotten him killed for the crime of writing his own life down, nobody keeps it. Nobody reads it. It commands no one, and it protects no one, and it matters to no living soul on this earth. His voice won. Theirs lost. That's not a tragedy. That's a victory. A quiet, stubborn, total victory. And George Piercy earned every inch of it with a piece of charcoal in the dark. The people who keep his collection will tell you something worth ending on. They'll tell you that Piercy stands in for a much larger group of men, the ones who kept no diary, who left nothing behind, who simply did not come home. There were thousands of them. Most of them we will never be able to name. He speaks for them now. That's what the record does. That's why it mattered that he wrote it, and that a one-legged man carried it home. Which brings me, before we finish, to you. Somewhere in your house. In a drawer you haven't opened in years, in a shoebox up in the attic, in an old folder gone soft at the corners. There may be a story a lot like this one. Smaller. Maybe. Quieter. No submarine. No hellship. But real. And every bit as much in danger of being lost. Your father. Your grandfather. An uncle. A neighbor. Somebody who was there. Maybe he told it once, across the dinner table, on a night when something loosened his tongue, and then folded it back up and never told it again. Maybe you were young and only half listening, and you'd give anything now to have paid closer attention. Maybe he never told it at all, and all you were ever left with is the shape of it. A ship he was on. A beach he landed on. a name he'd go quiet at, a friend he never once talked about for the rest of his life. Those men are nearly all gone now. And here is the hard truth of it. The history books are not going to keep their stories. There's no room. The books hold the generals and the big battles, and they have to, but they can't hold your grandfather. His story lives in exactly one place, in what somebody remembers, and in what somebody writes down. When the last person who remembers him is gone, that story is gone with them, unless somebody writes it down. So, write it down. If your father, or your grandfather, or anyone you loved served in the Second World War, tell me about him in the comments below this video. One line is enough. His name. Where he served. The one thing you remember him saying about it, or the fact that he'd never say anything at all. Put it somewhere. It won't disappear. Let the next person who scrolls by read it and know that man was real and that he was here. Because that, right there, is the exact thing George Piercy risked his life to do. He wrote in the dark, on garbage, under penalty of death, for one reason, so that the men around him would not be forgotten, so that somebody, someday, would know. We are the somebody. This is the someday. The least we can do, all these years later, is not let ours vanish either. He wrote it on garbage, in the dark, with a knife-sharpened stub of charcoal on the labels of tin cans, in a place built for the single purpose of erasing him from the earth. They put him at the bottom of the sea. They never gave his family a body to bury. And still, after all of it, against every intention of the empire that held him, his handwriting is here. Cared for. Honored. Kept. It's still here. And it always will be. That's the victory. That's the whole quiet, stubborn, American victory of George Washington Piercy. Not that he survived. He didn't. But that for all their searching and all their power, the men who tried to erase him lost, and the man they buried at sea is the one still speaking. Say his name once more before you go. George Washington Piercy, 1915 to 1944. Remembered, which is exactly what he wanted.